Okay, welcome to the Introduction to Linguistics class. Today we are going to talk about phonetics and phonology. As we said the previous day, we have two different branches of linguistics dealing with sound. We have phonetics, which is the field of linguistics that studies in a scientific way the sounds of language. And in phonetics, we have three different branches. We have articulatory phonetics, acoustic phonetics, and auditory or perceptive phonetics. Okay, we are going to cover phonetics only superficially because you have studied it already in Spanish language. But all I want to say is that in articulatory phonetics, we study how we produce the sounds of language. And what we know from studying all the languages in the world is that basically all languages of the world use the same type of sounds, okay? Because that has a physiological reason. We have, all humans have a specific articulatory mechanism that is universal. I mean, all humans have a larynx, we all have lungs, we all have, and we all produce sounds basically in the same way, okay? So all the sounds of all the languages that we could possibly make, we find in the different languages of the world, okay? And in articulated phonetics, we have to distinguish three main mechanisms that allow us to produce sounds. The first and the central part is the larynx. In the larynx, we find the glottal cords, and in the glottal folds of glottal cords, we have what we call the glottis, which is the space that remains between the glottal cords. And that space is very important because when we close the glottal folds of glottal cords, we stop the coming out of the air from the lungs, and this is where we cause the resistance that allows us to produce sound, okay? With the force that we use from the air that we breathe, we can make the larynx, the glottis, the vocal folds, we can make them vibrate, and that causes a disturbance in the particles of air that surround it. And this disturbance is the one that is going to produce the sound wave that is going to allow us to communicate, okay? So this is the central point where phonation, where sound is going to occur for us humans, okay? And underneath that, we have the subglottal mechanisms, which is basically the lungs and the diaphragm that we use to regulate this flow of air in such a way that we can produce softer sounds, or we can shouting, producing more strength, we can produce sounds with that are a little bit more powerful, that have a higher intensity, okay? So we can control that, but the subglottal mechanism don't do much more than that. Basically, almost all sounds in the languages of the world have the air from the lungs as their source of energy, okay? There are some exceptions. We have some sounds that you find in some languages of the world, which are called clicks, which are produced in a different way. If we, in Spanish and English, we don't use clicks in the phonetics or the phonology of the language, but in other languages we only use them for non-verbal purposes. Like, for example, when we want to give a kiss, we do something like this. Or when we want to say no, or where are you going, or we do something like, or when we want to cheer up a horse so that it goes faster. Okay, these are called clicks, and these are different from the other sounds in that the source of the energy does not come from the lungs, and we don't produce the sound in the larynx, so in the glottis. The way clicks work is that we close the oral cavity somewhere, and we also close the end of the oral cavity, and we produce entrance and an explosion through changing the pressure of the air from outside to inside so that the air enters. So the difference between clicks and all other sounds is that the other sounds are aggressive with the air coming out, but clicks are ingressive. The air is coming in, okay? And that's how we produce these clicks, which are auditorily and acoustically quite perceptible. We can perceive them very well, and so that's why they are very useful for languages of the world. But on the other hand, they are very difficult to pronounce in the way of making them with ease. They are very difficult to pronounce, and that's why there are very few languages that have these click sounds. Only some languages, Khoisan languages in South Africa and Bantu languages that probably have borrowed them from Khoisan languages, have these clicks. So only African languages, in the place where humans probably started their long journey to occupy the whole of the world, only these languages have clicks. All the rest of languages only use clicks for non-verbal communication purposes, for other type of purposes, but not in words and not in the phonology, okay? So these lungs are very important so that we can produce the energy to produce the sounds, but where the most important thing for articulation of sounds takes place is in the cavities that are above the larynx. We have mainly three main cavities. We have the pharynx, we have the oral cavity, and also what we call the nasal cavity, okay? And in the oral cavity is where we have the tongue, and that's what gives name to what we call in Spanish lengua, and what we gives name to what we use usually, no, to refer to language, la lengua. And it's this movement of the tongue that allows us to articulate a wide variety, a wide range of different sounds. If you look, for example, at vowels, possible vowels that we can make. Listen to this, the way we imitate how cows utter sounds. We say something like meow, and we are moving the tongue from e, a, o, u. So we have, in theory, we can make many different types of vowels, okay? And it's our tongue moving around the oral cavity that allows us to do it. Now, in order to define sounds articulatorily, usually we distinguish between consonantal sounds and vowel-like sounds. In consonant sounds, usually we use three parameters. We talk about the point or place of articulation, and there we distinguish between bilabial sounds, labiodental sounds, the interdental sounds, alveolar sounds, post-alveolar sounds, palatal sounds, velar sounds, uvular sounds. The uvula is the end of the soft palate, okay, the one that we use. If we put it down, we open the nasal cavity. If we put it up, the nasal cavity is closed, okay. Then we have also pharyngeal sounds, and we have also glottal sounds, which are the ones that we produce in the glottis, like the glottal stop or the glottal fricative, okay? That's the point of articulation, the first parameter that we use. The second parameter that we use is what we call the manner of articulation, okay? And we classify the consonants of the languages of the world according to whether they are stop consonants, where the articulators are completely closed, and we need to make an explosion to produce the sound. For example, click sounds are stop sounds. Occlusive sounds, also P, P, B, T, K, D ge, okay, all they are, because we close the articulators and we cause an explosion. We have to make an explosion to make it sound. Okay, then when we put the articulators not totally close, but very close together with a very narrow passage, so that when the air passes by, we produce some kind of sound, a product of the friction. We call this type of sound fricative. Okay, fricative sounds are very frequent in the languages of the world. We produce them when, for example, we put the tongue between the teeth, or if we make it voiced, or when we put the labiodental type of sound and we let air pass by, we can have the F, or we can have the which is the voiced one. Okay, then we have all the alveolar, post-alveolar, palatal, velar, fricative sounds, like, for example, s, sh, j, okay, these are all fricative sounds. When we combine an occlusive, a stop consonant, with a fricative, we have what we call, what phoneticians called, affricate sound. And affricate sounds are, for example, che, je, tse, combination of a stop consonant plus a fricative. Then we have what we call a nasal sounds. Nasal sounds are usually, nasal consonants are usually also stop consonants, because we stop the flow of air in the oral cavity. But with nasals, we lower the uvula, or the soft part of the palate, and we let the air pass through the nasal cavity. And we have sounds like m, n, in, okay? And these are what we call the nasal sounds. Then we also have what we call the liquids, which can be divided into two different classes, the lateral sounds. And the lateral sounds are different from what we call central sounds, in that we make a closure and we let the air go out in the sides, on the sides of this closure. We have, for example, L, or Lie in formers in Old Spanish, which are lateral sounds. In Spanish, this one and this one, L and Lie. This one has almost disappeared from Spanish nowadays. It's no longer used, only in a few villages. Then the other type of liquids is what we call, in Spanish we call them vibrantes, vibrante simple and vibrante multiple. In English they call them tap or flap, or the vibrante multiple they call trill. Okay, and we indicate like this. This is the flap or tap, and this is the drr sound that is so characteristic from Spanish. So vibrante simple, vibrante multiple. Then we have what we might call type of approximant sounds, which is they are still consonants, but they are closer to the vowels. Sometimes they are called semi-vowels, semi-consonants. Some of them is like the yod or this u, okay, that we use for diphthongs, or that we use in English they use for yes, you, okay. This sound is a kind of approximant. And basically these are all the types of consonants that we find in the languages of the world, okay, according to the manner of articulation. Finally, the third parameter that we use for consonants is what we call the state of the glottis. If the glottis is closed, there is vibration and the sound is voiced, the consonant is voiced. And then if the glottis is open, we find that what we call a voiceless sound, okay? I'm going to give you a mnemotechnic so that you can remember always all the voiceless consonants of Spanish. If you remember these three words, petaca, Josefa, and Choza. Okay, here you have, if we find the consonants that we have here, this is the P, this is the T, this is the K, which are the three voiceless stops. There are only three in Spanish, okay? In English also, these are the three. We have Josefa, which are three of the fricatives, and then this is Che, which is the only affricate that we have in Spanish, and then we have this theta sound, theta phoneme, that we only have in peninsular, in Spanish spoken in Spain. In America, they don't use this theta sound because they only use the S, okay? Okay, these 8 phonemes are the only voiceless phonemes of Spanish, okay? In other languages like Chinese, that some of you are studying, there are many more voiceless fricatives, okay, more than affricates. But in Spanish, these are all the voiceless. All the rest, all the vowels, all the nasals, all the vibrantes, all the liquids, all the vowels, they are all voiced sounds. Okay, only these 8 are voiceless. Okay, this is with regards to the consonants. What about vowels? How do we classify the vowels in the languages of the world? How do we classify how we produce them articulatorily? Okay, usually, as you probably know, we use this kind of depiction where we try to represent the position of the tongue in the space that occupies the vowels. So here would be the E, which is the highest vowel, and also the vowel that is more to the front, okay? The opposite is the U, which is back vowel, but also high, okay? Then here we have all the possible A, that, for example, that English have, these 3, okay? And here we have the low vowels, front and back and central, okay? Here we have the mid vowels, or O, okay? And here we have the totally central vowel that we don't have in Spanish, but in English is the most frequent vowel of all. And have you ever wondered why this, what we call schwa vowel, is the most frequent in the English language? Anybody knows why this is almost, in which type of syllable does this appear? In all syllables that do not have a stress, in all unstressed syllables, you find this. And why this? Because this is the one that is easiest to pronounce. You just have to place the tongue in the middle, and you get this sound, okay? So if you are speaking very fast in English and you don't have time for the unstressed vowels, for the unstressed syllables, you just produce this sound, okay? And that's why this is the most frequent of all. You have a corresponding tense one, which is this, the sounding work, word, Tony blur, okay? And this sound is equivalent to this, but it's not reduced. It's longer, a longer sound. But again, it's in the middle of the oral cavity, in the middle of the position where you can produce the vowels, okay? So for vowels, again, in a sense, we have also point of articulation, front, central, back, and also manner of articulation, like in the consonants. This is high, this is mid, this is open, close versus open, and this is, again, non-close, non-open. But in vowels, we also use 2 other characteristics. We use roundness of the lips. Usually the back sounds U, O are round, although we have the corresponding unrounded, like in Japanese, you have this U, U, U. And also in the front, they are usually spread vowels. You don't round the lips, but you could have, and this is the symbol we use in the International Phonetic Alphabet for this, U, U, that you are learning in Chinese, that you have in French, that you have in German. It's not very common, but you have it in some languages and some of the languages that we study. Basically, again, in vowels, we have point of articulation, manner of articulation, but also we have lip rounding. And also we have a distinction between tense vowels, vowels that are produced with strength, or lax vowels that are like reduced vowels that are produced with very little energy. Okay? So in vowels we add other characteristics. Why don't we talk about voiced or voiceless vowels like we did in consonants? Because normally all the vowels are voiced. Only when I speak with whispering are my vowels unvoiced or voiceless, okay? So, but that's not normal. Usually languages don't use voice vowels, okay? Because why are these so important, the vowels? Because the vowels constitute the head of the syllables in most of the languages of the world. And this is where we need to put, we need to have voiced sound here so that it can project and it can reach further, okay? Okay, this is basically the most important thing about articulatory phonetics, okay, that we have seen. About acoustics and auditory and perceptive phonetics, I'm not going to say a lot, but I would like all of you to understand some basic concepts, okay? And if you learn these 12 concepts, I will be pretty happy because you understand the relationship between articulatory phonetics, acoustic phonetics, and auditory and perceptual phonetics. I'm going to start. I'm going to draw some kind of diagram here so that you, and we are going to put here articulatory phonetics. Here we have the characteristic in acoustic, and here perceptive phonetics, so perceptual phonetics. Okay? Let's see how they are related. Now, where did we say that we produced the sound? In the glottis, in the larynx. So that's the crucial, the most important element, okay? Because sound is produced by the vibration of the vocal folds that on its turn makes a vibration of the particles of air that surround it. And this vibration is this wave that we originate in the vocal folds, in the larynx, is projected. And thanks to the resonators, to the oral cavity and the nasal cavity, we are going to be able to produce many different sounds. And we are unique, we humans, compared to apes, in that we can produce a wide variety of different sounds that languages of the world have used to create the systems that we will talk about when we talk about phonology, okay? So, in articulatory phonetics, the most important, well, if we compare articulatory phonetics to acoustics so that you can understand, the most important element of this vibration is what we call the frequency of the vibration, okay? It's also usually called F0 because it's also called fundamental frequency. And this has to do with the number of times that the vocal folds vibrate per second, okay? So, and we already know that if you are a child, since your larynx is smaller and your vocal cords are shorter, when you put air through the glottis, the vibration is going to be much faster and the frequency is going to be higher, okay? Also, if you are a woman, you are smaller usually than a man, the vibration is going to be faster. That's why the sound, the voice of a woman sounds of higher pitch, because this is how we perceive it. We perceive it as pitch, okay, which is how we perceive this frequency. the voice of women sound higher than the voice of men, because men, especially the larger a man is, or the larger the larynx is going to be, and the lower that the frequency that's going to be perceived as pitch. Okay, and now articulatorily, what does this fundamental frequency and this perception of pitch correspond to? The number of times per second that the vocal folds vibrate. No, number of vibrations per second, which usually for males is usually a fundamental frequency of 100. For females, for women, is the double, more or less, 200, a mean. And for children could be 300, even 400, okay? And usually we measure this in hertz, okay? Cycles per second, number of times it vibrates per second. Okay, this is very important because this is what gives me the fundamental frequency, how I'm going to perceive, how we're going to produce first, then how transmit through the air, and then perceive in. And this is what we use for intonation, okay? If I were going to speak like a machine with no intonation, no changes in the pitch, no changes in the fundamental frequencies, no changes in the times, number of times, cycles per second that my vocal folds vibrate, I would sound like a machine, okay? But we don't speak like that. We speak using intonation. We are always using this, and we use it to make questions, to make exclamations, to make all kinds of things. So this is very, very important element, and you have to understand that the frequency depends on the number of times the vocal folds vibrate per second, and we perceive that as pitch. In Spanish we call this altura, and we have low or high type of sounds, okay? Now, another very important element, and I'm going to put it here at the end, is what the time the vibration lasts. No, if I say ah, that's a short sound, but if I say ah, it's a long sound, okay? So what does it correspond articulatorily? It corresponds to the time of vibration of the vocal folds, no? Time of vibration of these vocal folds. And how this is perceived in your brain? It's perceived as duration. This is also a very important element, time. Now, another element that is very important acoustically and is very important articulatorily and how we perceive it is what in perception we call the intensity of sound. How a sound is produced in the vocal folds depending on how much air, how much strength, how much power I put in the air coming from the lungs. I'm going to manage that my sound is softer, but if I put more energy, I make it a sound that is louder, okay? And so how do I do it articulatorily? It's with the force of the air coming from the lungs, okay? How is it acoustically? This is what we call in acoustic the amplitude. Have you ever heard of the amplitude of the sound wave? Why is it called amplitude? Because, okay, if I put more pressure into the vocal folds are going to open more and close, and that's going to make the particles of air vibrate more. They're going to cause a displacement of the particles of air. So the amplitude of the sound wave is going to be longer, and that's going to correspond to a sound that is perceived as louder. Okay, you understand this? And so it depends on the force of the air. We are going to have a different amplitude of the sound wave, of this vibration, of this displacement of the particles of air, and that's going to be perceived in the brain with higher or lower intensity of sound. Okay? That we don't use in the languages of the world to make distinctions, but duration we use, the pitch we also use, but this is important so that our sound can carry or go further. It's also a very important element to distinguish stressed from non-stressed sounds. Okay, that's also important, although we will see that pitch is more important for stressed sounds. Okay, now the final three concepts that I want you to learn. These are probably, and I'm leaving them for the last because they are the ones that is probably more difficult to understand, but I'm going to try to make you understand, is what in Spanish we call the timbre of the sound. In English, and this is how we perceive the sound, in perceptual phonetics, we call it timbre in Spanish. In English, they call it voice quality. Okay? And now, what does that correspond articulatorily? It corresponds to how I place the articulators and where I place it and what kind of sound it is. It is oral or nasal, because it depends on how I locate my articulators. The acoustic signal, the kind of sound that I'm going to produce, is going to be different. And this is going to be perceived as a different timbre, a different quality. It is the same principle, and probably you all know that when you have a musical instrument, you have a violin, or you have a viola, or cello, you have a different quality to that instrument, and it depends on the resonance of the wood of this kind of instrument. Or if you have a flute, or you have a trumpet, or you have different quality, different timbre for each of these. Also, for each person, we have a particular voice quality that makes us unique, okay? Well, the same happens to the sounds that we are producing. E is different from U, different from A, different from sh, f, f. Because the kind, how we put our articulators is different, the kind of energy, the kind of acoustic wave that we produce is different, and the kind of quality or timbre is also different, okay? And that helps us, this is what explains why we have so many different sounds in the languages of the world, okay? Because we can place the articulators in different places, produce different acoustic spectrum of the sounds, and we perceive them as differently, and we can make all the distinctions that we are going to need in order to produce all the sounds that we are going to need in our particular language, okay? These are the basic concepts that you have to know about phonetics. Now, what happens with phonology? Phonology is a different branch of linguistics, and now if we were to put phonology hanging somewhere from articulatory, acoustic, or perceptual phonetics, we would place phonology here. Why? Because in phonology, what we study is how different languages in the world organize the sounds that are produced and are transmitted and are perceived in different systems. And the basic unit of phonology is the phoneme. And the phoneme basically is a category that we make, that we have in our brains, okay? And in different languages, we are going to organize this system in different ways, okay? Now, to give you an example, and we have already seen this in class. Some languages of the world, probably the majority, like Spanish, they have 5 vowel sounds, okay? So all this space that we saw earlier, we have in Spanish, we have A, which is an open vowel, central. We don't have any other A's in Spanish. In English, they have 2 more. We have an E, which is a central vowel and front. We have an E, which is a closed vowel and or high vowel and front. We have an O, which is back vowel, rounded and central, and we have an U, which is closed vowel, back vowel, and also rounded lips. The majority of the languages of the world tend to have 5. This is the most common number of vowels, okay? And notice how are they distributed and why this is important, because they tend to use most of the space so that we have clear categories, okay? But you have other languages that only have 3, for example, Arabic. And usually when you have 3, you have A, I, U. Other languages, and there is a claim that some languages have only 2, and usually it's a vowel here and a vowel here. Okay, but this is, some people say that this is not possible, only 2 vowels. On the contrary, there are languages like English that have up to 12 vowels, and you organize the space in a different way, and you have long vowels and short vowels. Other languages which combine short and long vowels, duration, with nasal, non-oral vowels, they might have up to 40, 50 different vowels, okay? But that's not the normal. The normal and the most frequent are systems with 5 to 7 vowels, okay? So in phonology, we study how of all the infinite number of possible vowels that you might be able to produce, because this is a continuum, okay? How many you use in your particular language to make distinctions, okay? And that's why we define phoneme as the minimal unit of language that doesn't have a meaning on its own, but allows us to make distinctions, to make meaning possible, okay? And this is probably the central idea that we have to understand, because when we are producing language, when we are speaking, when we are producing sounds, we are always co-articulating, producing one sound after another. The phonemes of the language of the world are characterized because they are a particular, very interesting type of category. It's a category that has different phonetic realization, different phonetic implementations, okay? So, and that's why we need to distinguish what we call phoneme in phonetics from what we call allophone. The phoneme is the category, okay? And the allophones is each of the different particular realizations, particular put into practice of the particular phoneme in a given language, okay? And to illustrate with an example, and I think we've already talked about these examples, but it's important that if I say this word in Spanish, the word dedo, and here we have a phonological transcription, okay? If you notice how you pronounce the word dedo, and you want to make a phonetic transcription, you realize that you do, the first one is a stop consonant, de, but the second one, you do an interdental fricative. You say dedo, dedo, dedo. What does this mean? It means that in the phonological system of Spanish, we have a voiced, then dental or alveolar stop consonant, voiced, then alveolar stop, which has 2 different realizations, one as a stop, but the other one as an interdental fricative, okay? And this would be the phonology of Spanish. How do we know this? Because we say dedo, or I say de, or de, and all Spanish speakers understand the same word, okay? Now, if we study this in English, we immediately realize that in the English language, the phonology is different for this particular type of sounds. In English, we find that de is a phoneme, but we also find that de is a phoneme. And how can you prove that? How can you prove that de and de are different realities in the mind, in the perceptual phonetics, in the perceptual apparatus of the English speakers, because these two sounds allow you to distinguish meaning. And that's the crucial thing about the phonemes. The phonemes allow you to distinguish meanings. The allophones, no, they don't distinguish meanings. They are just realizations or different variants of one particular category, okay? So how do we know that they and the in English are different phonemes? Because if I go and say something like they in English, or say something like they, I have two different words. I have dia, they is dia, they is ellos, ellas. In Spanish, this is not possible. In Spanish, if I say de or de, I'm saying the same thing, okay? So that this is how I know, and this is a very important concept that we call in phonology minimal pair. And this is the basic. If we look for minimal pairs among all the sounds that we hear from a language, eventually we will find the whole phonological inventory of this particular language, and we will know which of them are allophones and which of them are phonemes, independent phonemes. And this is basically what you have to do in the distributional phonological problems that you have to do for this class, okay? You have to analyze two particular sounds, and you have to determine whether they are the same and they are underlyingly one phoneme, or whether they are two different phonemes. Because this is when you have two sounds, this is the only two possibilities. Either they are the same phoneme or they are two different phonemes, okay? And this is what we do to study. If you want to become a field linguist and go to the jungles of Papua New Guinea or Brazil, to the Amazonian, and study a language that has never been studied before, you have to be equipped with a good ear to identify the different sounds, a good command of the International Phonetic Alphabet so that you know what the possibilities of sounds that you're going to find, and then you have to analyze, get a corpus of many different words, and try to find out how these sounds work in this particular language, okay? And basically, the most important concepts that you have to learn in phonology are the concepts of the type of distributions that we can find among the different sounds, the different that give us different types of representations in the phonology, okay? So we have what we call contrastive distribution of sounds. And this is when we have two sounds. I'm analyzing, for example, in Spanish, P and B. And I want to study what is the distribution of these two sounds. Okay, if I find things like peso, beso, and I give it to my informants and they tell me, oh, peso is one word, it means one thing. Beso is a different thing, means a different thing. Or in English, here English and Spanish are the same. If I say pet, 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 notice I pronounce a different allophone from Spanish, but it's pet, 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 pet. And I pronounce bet, bet, bet. I have two different words. No, pet is an animal, and es una mascota in Spanish. Bet is a verb that means apostar. Okay, so I know that P and B are in contrastive distribution because they allow me, they let me make distinctions in meaning. Okay, if I find minimal pairs, I have a case of contrastive distribution. This is important that you know, okay? Now, how do I know that I only have 5 vowels in Spanish and 12 vowels in English? Because if I start saying something like paso, peso, piso, poso, puso, I only find 5 possible vowels that I can change and create new words. If I say if I say a E with long piso or piso, I'm saying the same thing. If I say a different A, paso, 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 I'm saying the same thing, okay, in Spanish. Now, how do I know that in English I don't have only 5, that I have more? Because if I find a context, for example, I have B and T, and I start adding different possible vowels. Beat is one thing, bit is another thing, bet is another thing, bat is another thing, bat is another thing, okay? This Bart is another thing, bot is another thing, boot is another thing, okay? So I find many vowels, and that's how, through this use of minimal pairs, I find all the possible contrastive distribution among all the sounds, and I make my phonological system. And I discover that whereas in English, in Spanish, I only have 5 vowels, in English I have 12 or 13. I discover that in Spanish I have 19 or 18 or 17 consonants, depending how we count them, whereas in English I find 22, 23 consonants. Okay, and so I find different phonological systems by doing this, distributional analysis and finding this contrastive distribution. When I have allophones of a particular phoneme, I can have 2 types of distribution, what we call complementary distribution, or what we call sometimes free variation. This is not so frequent, but it's also important that we take it into account. The most frequent case is the complementary distribution. What is complementary distribution? This is probably the most difficult thing to understand in phonetics, but if you understand it, then you are going to know a lot about how the phonological system of a language works. Okay, now let's see something like these 2 sounds. Well, let's put 3. We have 3 sounds that we can make. These are bilabial stop consonants. I can have a p, p, p. This H indicates aspiration. I have a p, 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 p. And I have this b, 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 b. Okay? Now, if you go to a language like Thai, spoken in Thailand, okay? If you go to a language like Thai, you are going to find that in Thai, you are going to find contrastive distribution for these 3 consonants. You're going to have a word with P, which is different from P, which is different from B. So you can have 3 phonemes, okay? If you go to a language like Chinese, you are studying Chinese now, some of you are going to find that you have one phoneme, which is the p, 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 that in pinyin is usually written like this, but then you have another phoneme that is this p and b, usually written like this, and usually is voiceless. In some contexts, it could be voiced, especially between vowels, but usually it's voiceless, okay? This would be the distribution of Chinese, very different from Thai. In Thai, we have 3, in Chinese, we have 2. If you go to Spanish, in Spanish, you find that we don't usually have this one. We don't say pat, pa, pa, pa. No, we don't say that. We just say pe, and we just say be. We have 2 different phonemes. In English, you find that you have this one, okay? And then this one, also you have it in English. You have pe and pe as allophones of the consonant of the phoneme pe. Here, this one you find at the beginning of the syllable, or the beginning, p, p, pet, pet. But if you put an S before it, like Spain, Spain, now you don't have this one, okay? So, in what type of distribution are these 2? They are not in contrastive distribution because I cannot distinguish words with this, different from Thai. In Thai or in Chinese, I can distinguish words from these 2. But in English, no. Pe and pe are basically the same phoneme, okay? And we find that there is complementary distribution because this is found in a particular context, and this is found in different contexts. Okay? In Spanish, if we take the B, we find that the B and the fricative, the bilabial fricative, are allophones of the same phoneme B. Or as we saw earlier, D and D, the occlusive and the fricative interdental, are variations of the same phoneme, okay, in Spanish. How do we know this? We know this, but because we are never going to find minimal pairs, we are not going to be able to distinguish the same with B, okay? And also, if we go to the other, so that we cover all the class, the natural class of voiced stops, the same happens with G and G, which are, I'm going to erase this, so that, which are allophones of the same phoneme G. So we have B, G, and D, G, B, D, G, okay? We have three in Spanish, three different phonemes, and each of them has a pair of allophones. How do I know that they are allophones? Because they are in complementary distribution. How do I know that they are in complementary distribution? First, because I don't find minimal pairs, and second, because I always can predict in which context each of these is going to appear. Okay? I know that in Spanish, B, G, B, D, the stops, are going to appear after pause, when I'm not saying anything, and then I have D, okay, or B, or G, okay, then we have a stop, or after the nasal, en G, en B, cuando, okay? And in all the rest of the contexts, I'm going to have the fricative one, okay? Between vowels, in all other contexts, I'm going to have the fricative. So I know that they are in complementary distribution. How do I know that? Because when I see one, I'm not going to see the other. And in the context where I'm going to see the other, I'm not going to find the first one. Okay, I use an analogy to describe this. If you have a movie like Superman, you have Clark Kent and Superman. Clark Kent and Superman, how do you know that they are the same person? Because if you watch the movie, Clark Kent is in some context, Superman is in different contexts. You never find them together, because if you find them together, they have to be different persons. You understand? The same happens with the sounds. They are in complementary distribution. They appear in different contexts, in different situations. And when we have two sounds that share some traits, some characteristics that are similar, and appear in different concepts, you have good candidates to be allophones of one particular phoneme. Okay, and this is what we call complementary distribution. Now, the final type of distribution that you have to learn and that you have to take into account is what we call free variation. Let's see which one. This one doesn't paint. This one. Free variation. What does this mean? We have free variation with two sounds in a particular language when the two sounds are found in the same context, not in complementary context. They are found in the same context, but nevertheless, they are not minimal pairs. They do not distinguish meaning. I'm going to give you an example from Spanish. You have che, which is the affricate, post-alveolar, voiceless, and you have sh, which is the fricative post-alveolar, okay? And now, if we study these two sounds in English, we know that in English we have minimal pairs, and this one is a phoneme, and this one is a different phoneme. How do I know this? Because if I have a word like chip, or a word like ship, chip es como cambiar el chip, or potato chip, okay, ship es barco, okay, I know that I have contrastive distribution because I have minimal pairs, and I can use these two sounds to distinguish words. Now, what's the situation in Spanish? In Spanish, we usually use this affricate, the che, that we write with ch, okay? But sometimes, in particular dialects of Spanish, like in Canary Islands or the Caribbean or even here in Sevilla, some people say she, but you don't change the meaning. If you say mucho or you say mucho, you are saying exactly the same thing. And this is what we call free variation. You have the two sounds in the same context, because you have in this context in Spanish, mu, or if you put ch or you put sh, you are saying the same word. In English, no. In English, you would have two different words. Okay? In Spanish, they are the same word. That is because in some dialects they produce the stronger version, the affricate one. In some dialects, because the relaxation, economy of the language, they use the fricative one. Okay? And say if you say mucho or you say mucho, you are saying the same. And this is what is called free variation. Okay, if you know these three, you can take any two sounds in a particular language, analyze the data, and you can find out all the phonological system of a particular language. Okay, and that's really, really important. Can you tell me the time? How much time? So how much time I have? Still. Okay. Okay. So we have time. So this is the basic ideas about phonology. Okay, and if you know this, you can do the problems. Try to do the problems for tomorrow. And if you have questions, we can try to do one example here so that you can do it later at home. Now, what else do we have in phonology that is really, really important and interesting? Is that when we have the sounds, okay, the phonemes, we combine them. We don't usually have sounds isolated. We combine them, and we combine them into syllables, okay? And sigma, this Greek letter, is what we use as a representation of the syllable. And we have two parts in the syllable. We have what we call the onset, okay, and what we call the rhyme in English. In Spanish, we call this el ataque silábico or inicio silábico, and this is rima. And in the rhyme, we have the head, in Spanish we call it núcleo, the nucleus of the syllable, and we have the coda, okay? And now, it's important to take into account that this is the structure of a syllable, and it depends on the different languages. You are going to have more or less complex syllables. For example, Spanish usually is not a very complex, doesn't have a very complex syllable structure. English has a much more complex structure than Spanish. In English, you can have 3 consonants in the onset, 3 consonants in the coda. In Spanish, you can have the most 2 and 1 in the coda. And the coda, we don't usually have that many. In English, you can have up to 3. There are other languages, like Berber languages in Northern Africa, Slavic languages in Eastern Europe, that have even a more complex structure, syllable structure than English, and that even allow, in Spanish, we only allow vowels as nucleus, as head of syllables. In English, you can have a syllabic N or syllabic L, like the word bottle. This is the, if you have bottle, this would be a syllable, and we don't have a vowel here. This is impossible in Spanish. If you have a word like button, you have a glottal stop at the end is syllabic. In Spanish, this is impossible as a syllable. You have to have a vowel in Spanish for syllables. In other languages, Slavic languages, Berber languages of Northern Africa, you can have not only this nasal or liquid as head of syllable, but you can have even fricatives and even stop consonants as head of syllables. Okay, so the how the syllables are built and how they are organized is different in different languages. This is what we call in linguistics the phonotactic of a language, okay? And basically we can define this, the phonotactics, as the different combinations of sounds that make up the syllables in a particular language. And this is important when we have borrowings from one language to another. I'm going to give you a very simple example. In English, you have the word shampoo, no? And this is how you write it. And in phonetic alphabet, you would write shampoo. This is a word in English. How do we incorporate this word into Spanish? We say champú and adjust it to the kind of syllable that we have in Spanish. We don't have she because we don't have that sound, only in some varieties of Spanish. So we say champú. To give you a more interesting example, if we take a word like Spanish cucaracha, here we have consonant, vowel, consonant, vowel, consonant, vowel, consonant, vowel. This is very typical of words in Spanish under the phonotactic of Spanish. Simple syllable that are made up of consonant plus vowel, consonant with 4 syllables. This is typical of Spanish, but not typical of English. So when the English speakers borrow this word into Spanish, because this is a borrowing from Spanish into English, how do they pronounce this word? What do they say in English? How do you say cucaracha in English? You say cockroach. Now, how is it possible that cucaracha can become cockroach? Because in English you don't have this type of words with this type of syllables. In English it's more common to have shorter words with more complex syllables, and this is what they do, cockroach. You understand? The opposite happens when we borrow words from English into Spanish. If you have this English word, sprints, look at this is just one syllable, consonante, consonante, consonant, 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 vowel, consonant, 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 3 consonants, 1 vowel, 3 consonants, okay? How do we say this in Spanish? We say spring. No, this is how we pronounce it. We make it into 2 consonants, into two syllables that are simpler. Why? First, because this phonotactic unit, this is not possible in Spanish. This was possible in Latin, but from Latin to Spanish, we had this insertion of the A, okay, and we created this type of syllable. This is what we have this. Now, in Spanish, we cannot have this long, so we just say spring, okay? Now, what happened when they borrowed this same word into Chinese, sorry, not Chinese, in Japanese? You know how to say sprints in Japanese? In Japanese. They don't say spring like Spanish, they say su-pu-ding tu. So they say 1, 2, 3, 4 syllables. Why? Because in Japanese it's not possible to have the syllables that we can have in Spanish. They have to be much simpler. They have to be consonant, vowel, consonant, vowel. At the most you can have these, but they have to be simpler. That's why they have to make it into 4 different syllables, okay? But the same happens, you know the word, I think I've already talked about this word, you know the word vivaporú in Spanish? You'll know what vivaporú means. It's a word that we usually use orally, seldom write it. You know that vivaporú comes from people looking at this Vicks, which is a brand, vapor rub. No, Vicks vapor rub. How does Vicks vapor rub become vivaporú? Because vivaporú is the type of syllable we have in Spanish. VIX is not a syllable of Spanish, rap is not a syllable of Spanish. We have to adapt it into our phonotactics, the phonotactics of the Spanish language. Okay, that's important. The syllable then and the phonotactics, how we make syllables, is also very important. Another very important principle is that syllables are usually organized from more obstruent or less sonorant sound to more sonorant sound, and the most sonorant sound, sonorant, is the one that is the nucleus, the head of the syllable. Okay, and finally, with this I'm gonna give you the rest of the most important concepts in phonetics and phonology. We also have a branch of phonetics phonology that we call suprasegmental phonetics or phonology. Here is the same. What are the suprasegmentals of a particular of languages? Okay, are those aspects of language that cover more than one segment. A suprasegmental, some people talk about the syllable that we already saw. We also talk about stress, because stress, you have to take a whole word, several syllables, and you have to find the one. Imagine that we have consonant, vowel, consonant, vowel, consonant, vowel. You have to find the one that is most prominent. Okay, that's the stressed syllable. Now, how do we know? How do we usually identify a stressed syllable? Remember the 4 perceptual characteristics that we said earlier? We had frequency or pitch, we had duration, we have amplitude, intensity, remember, and we had the quality or timbre. Okay, the 4 take a role in identifying which one is the stressed syllable. But the most important one is the frequency, the pitch. Okay, the difference in frequency between the stressed syllable and the rest is what makes us possible to identify which one is the stressed syllable. More than intensity. Before it was believed that it was intensity, how loud it was. That's not the real cue, the real important element that we use for stressed syllable. Is the pitch. Okay? Another suprasegmental is what we call intonation, also tone, which is related to intonation. We distinguish tone because we use tone to talk about tonal languages. Those of you who are studying Chinese know that Chinese is a tonal language. How do we know that Chinese is a tonal language? Because it uses intonation in a different way from Spanish and English. It uses intonation to distinguish different words. So in Chinese, when you say ma, you mean one thing, mother. When you say ma, you mean a different thing. This is a different tone, rising tone. When you say a lowering and rising tone, low rise, is ma, that means horse. And when you say ma, the fourth tone, you have a totally different word. That's a tonal language. They use intonation to make distinctions in the words. Okay, that's a tonal language. All languages use intonation. Only half of the languages of the world use tone distinctively to distinguish words. And curiously, they have found in recent years, the son of Daniel Everett, Caleb Everett, he has discovered that the majority of tonal languages are located in the tropics, okay, in the areas where you have higher humidity, and you have higher humidity in your larynx, and probably that allows you to control the tones of language in a different way. We also have, please, duration as a suprasegmental characteristic. Also, we have speed, and finally, we have rhythm. And rhythm is probably one of the most important ones because it's a combination of the stress, the intonation, and all the patterns that are repeated. And different languages have different rhythms. You have a language like Japanese that has a certain type of rhythm because of the type of syllables it has. You have a language like Spanish and French that are organized in the rhythm according to syllables. The syllables have more or less the same duration, But you have a language like English that has a stressed-based rhythm, not a syllable-based rhythm. How do we know that? Because if you say a word in English like extraordinary, notice how the stress syllable extraordinary occupies almost all of the duration. Nevertheless, when we say extraordinario in Spanish, this nario is longer, but only slightly longer, okay? And this is the rhythm. So English and Spanish are different with regards to the rhythm, because English has a stress-based rhythm, and you are going to study that in the literature, in the poetry. The poetry that you write in English is very different from the poetry you write in Spanish. Spanish, French, and other languages are syllable-based. The rhythm is syllable-based, and that's very important. And I think that with this, I finish all the most important concepts that you have to learn in phonetics and phonology. Please read the chapters, and if you have any questions, bring them for tomorrow. Try to do the exercises. If you have any questions, bring them for tomorrow. Thank you for your attention, and see you tomorrow. Okay.